So let's talk a little bit about our agenda for the day. Our roadmap here will cover the next 50 plus minutes, and I want to kind of set some expectations up front so you know where we're headed. So first, we're going to talk about the Copilot reality. What actually happens when organizations rush a rollout without governance in place? This is not theoretical. We see it firsthand all the time. And then we're going to explain why Purview should come first, why governance is the enablement layer, not a blocker. This mindset shift for a lot of security, this is a mind shift block for a lot of security teams and IT leaders. From there, we're going to walk through a 4-phased Purview implementation approach we actually used, and which is to discover, to classify, protect, and to govern. This is the playbook that we found has been the most successful. And then we'll take a closer look at 3 specific Purview capabilities, which are oversharing assessments, a product called DPSM for AI, and also data loss prevention for Copilot. Each one will get its actual own live demo from Todd Brink. And then finally, we'll close with practical next steps. So a 30, 60, 90-day roadmap so you can take back to your team for Monday morning. So let's start with that reality check first off. So some statistics first off. Let's start with some of the good news, because there's actually plenty of it. Microsoft 365 Copilot is actually delivering real measurable results across the enterprise. 70% of the Fortune 500 companies are already using Copilot, and that's not just in a pilot or a proof of concept. That is actual mainstream adoption at the highest level. Currently, Microsoft just announced this quarter, they now have over 20 million paid Copilot seats. On average, enterprise users are saving about 3 hours per week using Copilot. At ProArc, we're seeing even higher returns. It's not unusual for us to see 90 minutes per week per person, which can add up to nearly 2 full hour weeks per person annually. So if you think about your organization and what they could do with that time back, it's pretty tremendous. Marketing teams are also reporting about 67% faster content creation. And that's not just around its efficiency. That translates to things like competitive advantage. The takeaway here is that the value, as I said before, is real. The value is proven. And the question isn't whether to deploy Copilot, it's how to deploy it safely. And that's what the rest of the session is truly. So before we talk about doing it the right way, let's talk about when it goes wrong. And so this is the slide I wish I didn't have to show, but it's the one most organizations really need to see. And here's what we see when a Copilot rollout is rushed without proper data governance. In scenario 1, you can assume and imagine here for a second, you have sensitive content that surfaces immediately when Copilot is put into place. And the reason being is Copilot can find anything the user technically has access to. That means things like salary spreadsheets, M&A documents, HR investigation files. All of that is going to show up in Copilot responses if your permissions are too broad. And the reality and the honest truth here is, in most tenants, they are usually too permissive. Nobody realizes this until Copilot makes it very visible to you. Scenario 2, we have a pilot where it stalls around 20 to 30 users. And the reason here is that leadership gets spooked after they have that first incident. So at this point, the pilot could potentially get paused, executive sponsorship starts to dwindle, and now you're really fighting an uphill battle to get things back on track and actually get some real enablement and adoption in place. So in scenario 3 here is where if we don't address these things, trust in adoption begins to erode. Users stop trusting the answers that Copilot gives them. Security teams go into lockdown mode. They restrict access to these AI tools reactively, and adoption completely stalls, which is the worst possible outcome altogether. Because now you've spent money, but not actually getting any value. So every one of these scenarios is preventable, and that's the whole point of today's session. So This really is one of those slides, what I think is one of the most important slides in the entire presentation, because it corrects a very common misconception. And let's start with what Copilot does not change. So Copilot doesn't change your permissions. It doesn't change which files a user can open. It doesn't alter any of your sensitivity labels, your retention policies, or your data loss prevention rules. And it doesn't change the Microsoft 365 service boundary. Everything's still in your tenant. What Copilot does do, though, is it changes how fast users can find content they already have access to. It changes how far content can travel once it's surfaced through things like summaries, and chat, generated documents, and most critically, it makes all of the pre-existing governance debt invisible. Every overshared site, every stale permission, everyone except external users group, the Copilot finds all of that stuff. So the cost of doing nothing with oversharing goes up dramatically with Copilot. The data was always there. Copilot just makes it a lot more discoverable, typically in seconds instead of hours. And this is why at ProArt, we really say Copilot is built on trust. If users can't trust the answers, they won't use it. And if security can't trust the boundaries, they're going to block it. And ultimately, AI adoption stops. So as it relates to where oversharing typically lives, and we look at our tenants, SharePoint sites are usually the biggest offenders here. Org-wide sites with everyone permissions, usually open team sites from projects that may have ended long ago, and also legacy sites that nobody owns anymore. All of that content is still fully accessible to Copilot. Team channels are usually next. We have private channels and chats, often that have standing members who may have left the project, but were never removed. And those conversations and the files shared within them are still accessible. And OneDrive is the third major area. So anyone with things like the link sharing or external guest access or still have access, or if there are orphaned accounts from people who've left the organization, all of that adds up and all of that becomes part of the information that Copilot can reason over, whether it's accurate information or not. And that brings us to the last item really, which is the stale content. Inactive sites that sit untouched for months or probably more likely years with sensitive data still inside. Users don't see them, but Copilot absolutely does. The pattern is pretty darn clear. Oversharing is usually everywhere. It's accumulated over years and it's invisible until Copilot surfaces it and makes it visible. But the good news is that Purview gives us the tools to find it and fix it in a very systematic approach. So with that said, I am going to hand off to Mike McLean, who's going to start giving you a little bit of a primer on Purview.
So just to start, first off, good afternoon, everyone. What is Purview? Purview is a data governance platform. Some of you may have already rolled out Purview to your environment, whether it be in small amounts or in mass. However, it is the native governance platform for 365 and Azure as a whole. It's a unified security solution. It touches on pretty much every aspect of Azure and 365, protects against unauthorized use of data across cloud devices, generative AI applications. It also protects against exfiltration events and insider threats. It also provides fast investigations and responses to data security incidents, which empowers your IT instead of spending hours trying to run down certain investigations and events. They can get alerts within minutes and really pinpoint what is going on with their environment. There are several aspects of Purview. Okay. Thank you. You see the primary pillars here on the right for Purview. Information protection, it really gets into your data labeling. Your data loss prevention is to prevent data from either going out the door to the wrong people or data internally going to the wrong people. HR data accidentally be sent to frontline workers, for example. And Purview Insider Risk Management really deals with, just as it says, insider risk management. What can your users do? Are they oversharing? Who's the most risk of sharing too much information or being the biggest threat internally. We do next slide now. Why the governance order matters. Permissions cleanup after a pilot is extremely difficult and time-consuming, and I'd like to press home the time-consuming portion of that. Once AI is enabled within your environment, we call this the AI Pandora's box situation, and you really can't undo that. Trying to clean up after the fact, whereas you could have a project that takes 6 months to get your data in order before rolling out AI, you could be looking at multiple years if you're not careful. Baseline Purview controls will let you pilot quickly and safely by making sure you at least have the baseline controls in play to make sure oversharing is not as big a threat as it possibly could be. As you see there, the statistic too, 80% of leaders cite leakage of sensitive data as their main Gen AI concern. And this is, we work with many clients day in, day out that come to us saying, hey, we need a Purview rollout because we turned on AI and now we have data going out the door that we weren't aware of, and so on. Purview is here to enable your AI adoption, though. It's not just to be a blocker to your entire AI adoption. We want Purview to give you trust in Copilot responses so users will stop second guessing their answers. If the data that Copilot is looking at to give answers is not in good standing, or its legacy, as Jim had said, your responses are not going to be pertinent to their work, and then your adoption stalls because users are going to look at Copilot as it's not helping me, so why should I use it? It also gives IT confidence, and this is probably one of the biggest things we've seen here at ProArc, is that our clients' internal IT, giving them the confidence to expand a rollout with using Purview into Copilot is one of the bigger blockers. And once that blocker is removed, user adoption becomes even more scaled. And that really rolls into the leadership approving a broader investment. Once leadership is able to see that, hey, we're not going to have data flying out the door that we don't want, sensitive information is not getting in the wrong hands, then they will approve a broader investment and start really seeing that ROI on their initial pilot and a Copilot as a whole investment. Slide, please. So what are the capabilities of Purview that are really key to an AI adoption? The number one, the very first thing is addressing oversharing, whether that means through things such as identity and access, and then remediation of where that oversharing has occurred. Next is to prevent against data loss. Purview with DLP, data loss prevention, and sensitivity labels. It gives you file level protection that travels with the file, even externally. Insider risk is to help detect risky AI usage, along with telling you what users may be the greatest risk, which includes policies that will auto-tighten or really adjust on the fly, depending on that user's actions and interactions with Copilot. Audit and retain interactions is where you can guide Copilot to keep or delete Copilot prompts and the responses to match your retention strategy. So if your company has a compliance department that's adopted a retention strategy for the entire company, this is really a technical control to keep Copilot prompts for a certain period of time to match that policy. Legal hold and e-discovery, you can include Copilot content in litigation and investigations and admin searches. This becomes very powerful because then your e-discovery cases and your litigation cases can be trimmed down from days and weeks into moments with the correct configuration in Purview. It also helps map to regulatory compliance. We're seeing more and more compliance structures pick up AI acts and guidance across the spectrum, whether you be in healthcare or FINRA and so on. Next slide, please. So how did ProArch implement Purview? As Jim initially mentioned, the step-by-step here is discover, classify, protect, and govern. Step one was to find where our sensitive data and oversharing lived. You may be in a situation where you're like, I know I have sensitive data. How do I, but I don't know exactly where it's at. Or it may be fragmented across many different shares within your tenant. Once you figure out that, which Purview will enable you to figure out where that information is, you can get oversharing reports across the tenant. We would then risk and rank the backlog of overshared information from a high, medium, low. You don't want to chew off the whole thing, especially if you have a very large data estate. Try to get those into what's the easiest, what will take a little bit of effort, what's a large lift to address as far as oversharing. And furthermore, data security investigations is also a new thing that has came out within Purview that is AI driven, but will help you to further look for oversharing and look for unlabeled files, fragmented data, and really to help that first step into discovering where your sensitive data lives. Next will be applying sensitivity labels that travel with the files after you have reeled in your oversharing of data. Using a simple 3 to 4 tier taxonomy users will apply and understand is very important, we have found, especially within our own internal journey. And what does that mean? It's as simple as having a highly confidential label, a confidential label, a internal use label, and a general label for every document that's out there. We then went through an auto labeling, which what that means is auto labeling will look for certain keywords within files or certain combinations, and then will label those files using that 3 to 4 tier taxonomy. Label inheritance and file encryption. If you have a label that is on a file and you attach it to an email and it goes out the door, that email may not have been encrypted or set to encrypt, but because it had a higher level attachment to it, it then raised the classification of that email as it left outside your organization. Stop what you can now see. So what this means is DLP for Copilot. After classifying and having labels, you can then craft DLP policies around Copilot to block specific content. So if, in this example, we used a 4-tier taxonomy, we don't want highly confidential information being fed into Copilot. What we would consider a highly confidential document would be something like HR data, which is going to contain PII, social security numbers, personal internal employee information. We don't want that fed into Copilot. And we don't want it to be used or considered for any Copilot answers. We then implemented inside a risk to detect risky patterns. That way, if we see users that may not be using highly confidential, but we see them using a lot of confidential labeled documents inside their Copilot interactions, our insider risk patterns will then lower or raise a risk of a particular user so that our compliance staff can watch for those patterns and take further action if necessary. And endpoint DLP beyond the M365 boundary. What does this mean? What endpoint DLP is, so if we have a document on your local machine and you attempt to feed it into a third-party solution such as a Claude, a ChatGPT, with your endpoint DLP, you can watch for those sort of interactions with external or even browser-based AI solutions, which we implemented here to make sure that Copilot is our one and true source of AI here at ProArch, unless it's for R&D situations, but it's very controlled. And then governance, we then meet quite a few regulatory requirements and lifecycle requirements for audit and retaining information in AI holds, just so that we can show proof of concept and to keep our own internal structure safe. Furthermore, in governance, what Purview allows you to do is with DSP and for AI, it gives you a single executive view pane of what is going on with your AI interactions, to the point that it gives you visibility into what your users are feeding into the AI and what is coming back out. In other words, if I ask Copilot a question and it gives me an answer, me as the administrator, I can go into Purview and see those exact interactions. So breaking this down even further, phase one, discover where your risk lives. And this really is going to start with SharePoint. Oversharing reports across our tenants is where we began. We ran down what that oversharing was, and then started to identify those sites in sensitive data, broad permissions, and high access, information that maybe everyone had access to or went beyond departmental need. And then we've triaged those into a risk rank backlog, trying not to boil the ocean, as it says here, but to not bite off too much, because it can become a very daunting project unless you really get this. Try to go for your quick wins and then move on from there. You can also run data security investigations to help create labels, weed out false positives and beyond through a handheld approach. This is a Purview tool that will help you once you get to the point of running your oversharing reports and beyond. It can help you apply your labels and weed out the false positives on the fly, along with look for further potential oversharing or intradepartmental access that shouldn't exist. In phase two, once we got through our triage and running through our backlog, we started applying the 3 to 4 simple taxonomy, labeling taxonomy. And the reason we do it this way, instead of having 20, 30 labels, having a simple 3 to 4 tier taxonomy is one of the biggest boons an IT staff can have for user adoption. Say you don't use auto labeling because maybe it's too large of a project. Having a simple taxonomy that users can simply just click on because they know this has PII in it, it's going to be highly confidential, that they can click on the fly, they will adopt it and start using it across the board much easier than if you had 20, 30 labels available to them. We then moved into auto labeling, which would detect credit cards, M&A terms, HR data, financial data, and so on, to put those into that 3 to 4 tier taxonomy automatically. Label inheritance with Copilot responses, and they'll inherit the highest priority label. We've set this option so that when the Copilot gives a response, if say it would give a response that includes highly confidential and confidential data, it's going to label that whole interaction as highly confidential because of the inheritance. And then with file level protection, we have encryption and usage rights or traveling with any files that get sent into Copilot or provided by Copilot in responses. Furthermore, okay. Phase 3, into protection. Okay, we now know where our sensitive data lives. We have it labeled. What do we do now with our to watch how our users are interacting with that data and to make sure we don't have any exfiltration events and beyond? Step 1 was DLP for Copilot. That way we can block the processing of certain labeled files, and step 1 was to disallow AI interactions with any PII and legal content, which could be content that is related to our clients, related to any of our internal employees. We do not want that to be processed by Copilot whatsoever. We then have insider risk enabled to detect those risky prompts and sequence alerts over time to be able to watch for behavior that we deem, or that Purview will deem to be risky, to where we can take further action on it if necessary. And then we did endpoint protection, which again, that is so if files are manipulated on the local machine for a user, if they are pasted and uploaded into a sensitive or fake sensitive content and throw it into an AI tool beyond the 365 sphere, then we are going to get alerted on it, know about it, and be able to block and take action on it within moments of that interaction occur. With phase 4, governing, we're now able to audit every Copilot prompt, response, and reference file captured via DSPM for AI. We can see all interactions, what was put into Copilot and what was provided back from Copilot, along with any files that were uploaded or provided. We were also able to implement our data lifecycle. So we were able to take our agreed upon controls as a company and turn those into a technical control. We're able to now include legal hold and e-discovery content and litigation holds. And we are able to use Compliance Manager within Purview, which is a set of controls that Purview provides to map to different acts such as the EU AI Act, NIST AI, and beyond. As well as now we can use DSPM for AI to just monitor across the board what our AI usage is daily and look for any further risks that may not currently be covered.
All right.
So I will toss this over to Todd Brink, and we will go through a overview and walkthrough.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me okay? Mike? Good? Yeah. All right. Here, I want to go through. First of all, I'll pull up some slides here. We've been going, if you've noticed, there's a real pattern to what we've been talking about. And this is going to follow that as well. But I'll be showing you in Purview, the portal itself, how we're actually doing these things for discover and classifying and labeling, protecting and governing. And these are the areas that we want to talk about. And like we've said, is the oversharing aspect is probably the most important place to start out, because you are going to establish your proper permissions, not only from SharePoint sites and users, but you're going to give Copilot some guardrails to operate within. And that's really the first step that we want to do. The next steps, like labeling, things like that can interact with Copilot, are just as important. I'll go through and show you where this is. I have a demo site, so it's not going to have much stuff on there, but I'll just be referencing that area and what kind of things you can get from the oversharing assessment. We'll also look at, like Mike mentioned, DSPM for AI. There's an activity explorer that shows user activity, what they accessed, what app they used, all kinds of details on prompts they sent and the response that Copilot gave back if it was allowed to actually access a document and provide a response. It also will show what things were blocked. So these are very important for managing risky users or using this data to actually elevate the risk of a certain user. And as far as DSPM for AI, this is like an example of what a user might experience if they go to a place like ChatGPT. This would be a DLP type policy, or even Copilot if they want to try and access information. They'll get notifications that tell them the reason why you're getting this blocked is because there is sensitive information contained in this document, or you are trying to send in a prompt sensitive information, which we do not want to have happen. So now I just want to keep this slide here so we can follow along with where I'm showing stuff. So here, this is actually in the SharePoint Admin Center. It's not actually in the Purview portal. So here you can go in and run your oversharing assessment. So it goes through all of your SharePoint sites and it gives you things like broken permission inheritance, or anytime you have everyone added. Sometimes when people are in a hurry to get a SharePoint set up, they just do the everyone button and then everybody has access, including Copilot, which we're starting to see just how dangerous that can be, especially for different departments, HR, legal, finance, all those things that contain tons of sensitive information. So this is how we're going to discover where information is and how vulnerable, I guess you could say, it is in people's OneDrives and SharePoint sites and all that. So then we want to move into classifying this information as well, which is our second tier of protection that we want to put on documents. So that's where we head over into the Purview portal. And how we classify documents and content is under information protection in the portal. Microsoft has these things called sensitive information types, or SITs. And these are, currently they have over 300 out-of-the-box information types. Some of these are very generic. It will trigger on almost everything, all full names. Not necessarily the best information type to use because you'll come back with just a ton of different hits. So what we can do is use things that are more specific. There's U.S. Social Security numbers. I'm using that in my demo here. When we have things like that, has a lot higher accuracy rating. So we'll be scanning documents that seem like they have Social Security numbers in them. And then based on that's when we'll label that document. And excuse me, Mike mentioned that there is a manual labeling that people can do within their apps, Word and all that. It looks like this over here on this screen. You just select whatever kind of label you want. And then there's auto labeling, which runs in the background 24/7. And it's constantly scanning documents all over the place. So at first it looks at more recent live documents, and then it starts moving into kind of the more dark data that people will have around for 7, 10 years. Just that stuff that we don't really want to have around because it just increases our attack surface. This is one of the ways that we can really classify documents well. There is an EDM classifier, which I won't go into too much detail, but that is a custom classifier that is based off of actual data for whoever the client is. So a good example would be we would get a database pull from somewhere like Workday, and then we would take that database and then create a classifier off that. So we're actually using real Social Security numbers, and the accuracy is as close to 100 as we can get using that. So that's one of the most preferred ways to classify documents. So once we have that classification in place, this is the labeling area. So a label in itself is really just basically like a sticky note on a document saying, okay, this is public or protected or confidential, something like that. But there are other aspects with labels that can be configured. And one of the aspects is auto labeling within the label. So for example, if somebody has a Word document, and they're writing something and they copy and paste a bunch of Social Security numbers in there, they would get a pop-up or a policy tip from Purview that says, hey, you just entered this information. We suggest you use this label. Or it can just automatically label it. So we try and remove as much manual work for the end users to have to constantly make sure that all their documents are labeled by having this aspect of auto labeling as well. So it's very handy. And excuse me, the most users actually come to really like this because they feel like they're doing their part as far as data security goes, which is important. So the next thing I wanted to show, and this is the protect portion. So we're on this phase 3 here. So this is where we get into data loss prevention. And specifically in this case, we're going to be talking about Copilot. So we want to make sure that we have guardrails with Copilot for accessing documents that might have sensitive information or communicating with a Copilot through prompts and not allowing sensitive information to go out. And then also, I think there's a part in here where I have a ChatGPT as an example as well. So we want to prevent users from sharing sensitive information outside the company. So, there's 2 examples here. Here's one of the policies that is mainly dealing with more cloud-based things or talking to managed apps like ChatGPT. And then there's all the Microsoft Copilot stuff in here as well. And this covers the web version of my Copilot that a lot of people will have open during the day when they're wanting to get information about whatever, internally for work stuff or through the web. So it's covering that. And then the nice thing here is these are the things that we would looking for an example. So these are the rules within the policy. And for example, this one here is looking for the U.S. Social Security number. So anytime it detects that, it's going to enable the actions for this DLP policy. Then I also have an example using a label. So here I have sensitive restricted label. If a document has that, don't allow Copilot to access it or process the contents for analysis. So this policy here, let me go back. This one here is Copilot operating within your tenant. So this is an example of you ask Copilot to say, here, go show me all these documents that contain information about the last quarter's financials or something like that. They're trying to find a document. This way, same thing. I'm searching for socials and certain labels. And then let's see. Now I want to show you, here's the Activity Explorer, because, so for example, I took this document and I tried to upload this document and then it blocked that. So here's an example of what the DLP rule would, when it matches. You can see here you have the user, you have which policy it is, which rule that got triggered, what the actions are, and then it also shows you the sensitive information that was detected or that was involved in that action. Here is a good example of Copilot when you ask it and you say, go access this document and use this in returning your results. So down here, you can see there's prompts in here and you see the responses, but then Copilot says, I tried to get this file open, but its contents are protected, so I can't be retrieved for analysis. This is exactly what we want to happen when we have sensitive information all over our SharePoint sites. We don't want Copilot to go in there. And like Jim was saying in the very beginning, brand new hire that says, oh, cool, Copilot, I'm going to type something in. And then all of a sudden he has all this information on salary information or performance reviews or things like that. So that's really what we're trying to protect here. Let's see. I think basically I think that's the end of this portion of the demo. So Jim, if you want to take back control and move on to the licensing. And if you have any questions about some of the areas that I showed you, just put them in the questions and we'll respond to those.
All right, we're going to give just a quick overview on licensing. Do want to really call out that Purview is something that is accessible for nearly any licensing level within 365. And I say nearly. There are a few caveats to that. So if you are in E3, there is a compliance or Purview Suite add-on, which will give you a lot of the advanced features for management and site governance, especially on SharePoint, which will also leads into your site level oversharing, sensitivity labels, and protection abilities within Purview, your auditing and basic retention for Copilot content, and the ability to do e-discovery and legal holds for Copilot and beyond. The more optimized way would be to go with 365 Copilot and 365 E5. You get with this direction, you get site and file level oversharing assessments from SharePoint. It also enables you to go into auto labeling and DLP for Copilot, along with the insider risk features and risky user auto type. You also get communication compliance, which allows or essentially will help block oversharing and internal oversharing. Then DSPM for AI, which is that executive overview for all AI interactions that we were demoed. This also gives you assessments within Compliance Manager to see how you stack up against things such as NIST, ISO, and like the EU Act, along with a plethora of other compliance structures. Go next slide. The minimum Purview baseline, what we suggest, is discover and classify. And really, first step one is always going to be a tenant-wide oversharing assessment, just to see where your gaps may lie. High-risk sites, then remediated or access restricted. sensitivity label taxonomy and making it simple to 3 or 4 tiers for easy adoption by your users. Auto labeling for top sensitive info types. So that way, you know that any of your sensitive information has always got a label, which you can then craft further governance protections around. Then finally, label inheritance enabled for Copilot responses. That way, proper labels will be attached to all Copilot responses, and they will inherit the highest level, sensitivity label that was hit by the interaction. You move into protecting and governing with DLP, especially for your top tier labels, to make sure your highly confidential information is not being touched or highly sensitive. Insider risk management to be able to further govern and watch users, along with being able to craft further policies if necessary, depending on their interactions. Retention policies for Copilot interactions. That way you don't have legacy Copilot interactions sitting out there creating a data debt that could bite you later. And then an audit log review cadence is established where we have internal IT that weekly and biweekly will review certain logs of those interactions to ensure that there's no clandestine interactions going on with AI. And then finally, compliance manager assessments to ensure that we're consistently meeting AI regulations. Next slide, please. And so how do you sequence your rollout? Really, for most data estates, especially with a lower amount of users, you'd be looking at, for assessments, usually 0 to 2 weeks, just depending on how large your data estate is. This would include your oversharing scan, a pilot scope definition, defining what users' devices are going to be included in that Copilot pilot, and as well as getting your risk triage list together from your oversharing scan, and then presenting to get executive alignment on what the phased approach will be. From there, you're looking at about 2 to 6 weeks to fix the highest risk sites and define your sensitive label taxonomy, and then start manually labeling that way you can start labeling your highest risk sites first. Then starting on week 3, you would be looking at turning on DLP for Copilot. And sorry, I said week 3. Step 3, which usually takes 6 to 10 weeks, you would turn on and test DLP for Copilot and enable insider risk management and set up audit retention. These protect actions take generally anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, I have seen, just to ensure to create the policies and then make sure the policies are doing what you want them to do. That'll be testing and deciding how far to scale them at that point, which gets into weeks 10 plus is your scaling, establishing DSPM for AI review cadence, expanding the pilot beyond the initial 10, 20, 30 users you may do, and then begin your regulatory mapping using Compliance Manager or your own internal checks. So you could also run this with a 30, 60, 90-day plan, and this is essentially how we tried to run it here within ProArc. It's more of the same as far as running an oversharing assessment across the pilot, defining your taxonomy, and then doing a short list of the top 10 risk sites to remediate. At 60 days, looking at publishing and pilot labels, enabling auto labeling, and stand-up DLP for Copilot in simulation mode to see how far its reach is. Then at 90 days, moving for Copilot from simulation to enforcing, turning on insider risk and DSPM for AI reviews internally, and then start mapping to compliance. Excuse me. How can we help here at ProArc when it comes to actually moving into an AI pilot and rollout? We have several programs here on the data security side, which begins with a foundational alignment that really will define a business-aligned data classification, retention, and governance model. That classification model will help you come up with your labeling taxonomy, and your retention policy will drive home what data you choose to keep to align it to your business needs or even legal needs. Then within our accelerator module, we'll implement the core Purview controls, which is your sensitivity labels, retention, DLP, and then DSPM for AI. In advanced, this is where we get into more custom controls for your organization, whether that be AI-aligned governance, which are custom made for your business, enhanced data discovery to ensure that things outside of the 365 sphere are covered, such as items in Fabric or third-party sources, and further extending insider risk management. We also have a Copilot and Purview Smart Start. This is a baseline and remediate the highest risk oversharing quickly, and it's a 4 to 6 week sprint. This is essentially to get you off the ground to a go live pilot of Copilot as quick as possible and in a safe manner. This is really ready. Seems ready to move from awareness into action when it comes to Copilot and governance. Of course, there are more things to do after the fact when you start doing a smart start, but this will get you to a very safe point very quickly.